It's 8 a.m., and I'm opening a beer to talk about alcoholism. If you find this ironic, please let me know in the comments. Cheers. Ho, 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 and welcome back, everybody, to Drizztmas. And this is the penultimate one, the 12th one, the one where we talk about Wolfgar. We, and no one else. And others. This is the 12th Drizzt novel in publication order, and it doesn't have any Drizzt. Hooray! Um, It is, yes, as I said, the second book of the Paths of Darkness subseries, a trilogy, and the 12th in publication order, and it focuses on Wolfgar and all the stuff he gets up to, why everyone else is doing unnecessary bullshit somewhere on their way to Cataly, and who really wants to meet Cataly? Am I right? Anyway, we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a plot summary, and then we'll talk a bit about structure, and then we'll talk about, all the other stuff as always. So let's get started with the plot. This book, as I said, focuses on Wolfgar and Driz, Cadbury, Brunner, Regis only show up in memories, which is still too much, but at least, we got to take what we can give, what we can get at this point. So what happens is the following. There's basically two plot lines that get combined over time. The one is about Wolfgar and his new friend, Morik the Rogue, hanging out in Luskan and descending ever further into alcoholism and despair. Wolfgar is technically the bouncer of the Cutlass, but he's usually incredibly drunk and gets into even more fights and drinks even more and more and more. All of that to forget all his trauma from being tortured in the abyss by a demon for 6 years, which, is something that happens. Now, that's the one part. During that time, as I said, he descends further and further into that until he gets fired. During that situation, his Warhammer Aegis Fang gets stolen. This will come up later. By later, I mean tomorrow. He punches up everyone, leaves the woman that he started a relationship with. Yes, there is actual fucking in this book. Mark it down. It doesn't happen too often. That being a barmaid named Deli Curti. I talked about her recently as well. Anyway, so he leaves all of that. He gets implicated, falsely implicated, in the attempted murder of Captain Deutermond, famed pirate hunter and really boring good guy. Him and Morik escape because Deutermond realizes they're innocent and, you know, gets them off the hook there, gives them a pardon. So they leave Luskan. They try to be highwaymen, kind of fail at that because Wolfgar is a bit of a good guy, and end up, getting implicated. Well, they do highwaymanning and rob a carriage. After that, they combine with a second plot line. That second plot line takes place in the small kingdom, or whatever it's called, realm called Orkney. Yeah, there's a joke there, I'm sure, where young Lord Ferringal Orc gets. I should probably mention that it's spelled Auck, so that's where the joke is. Sees a peasant girl named Merelda. He falls in love with her, incredibly in love with her, and makes her his wife over time. And there is a lot of conflict there because she obviously loves another one, but she has to kind of give in to the Lord because he can help her mother who is sick with, priest and whatnot. And the problem is she gets into the worst of all sins, which is premarital sex with the guy she actually loves at that point, and gets pregnant. So when she realizes all of that, she comes up with the story that during that highway robbery where Wolfgar and his friend Morik the Rogue um, took over her coach, she got raped by Wolfgar. Yes, this is the one where we get dark topics, and the kid is in fact her child. Now, Wolfgar gets captured. Her husband at that point, the Lord, decides to castrate him. Wolfgar flees. She helps him to flee because he's got a bit of a bad conscience. The child gets born. Everyone realizes it's a bit too early for Wolfgar to be Wolfgar's child. Wolfgar wants to help her, so he storms the castle, takes a child, walks away, suddenly becomes sober, and goes back to Luskan, apologizes to everyone in the city, decides to move to Waterdeep together with his newfound girlfriend, Deli Curti. And we'll leave all of this with the setup where two things can happen. One of them is Morik the Rogue gets contacted by Judd Axel to become their Artemis Entreri in Luskan, like the business front for breaking the Earth. The other one is, of course, Wolfgar sitting in Waterdeep deciding to hook up with Captain Dudemond to find his Warhammer, which got sold to an evil, because all of them are evil because they're women, female pirate. We'll see how that goes in future books. That's sort of roughly the plot here. Yeah. Now let's look at the structure quickly, and then let's go and look at all the other stuff. Because this book is all other stuff, basically. Okay, the structure. It's another four-parter, and even though Drizzt isn't in these books, we get his stupid opinions at the beginning of every part in these first-person narrations, where he talks a bit about how evil drinking is and drugs are, which is interesting because apparently it's totally fine when dwarfs drink, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And talks a bit about overcoming your past, and it's the usual waffling. It just feels even more banal in a story that is so much about trauma and violence and darkness and stuff like this, which, you know, that's kind of the problem. Beyond that, yeah, we start out with both parts individually, skipping between points of views of Wolfgar slash everyone around Wolfgar in Luskan, with some Dudemont stuff, who, recognizes Wolfgar, wants to help him. Wolfgar doesn't want to get help. Then we have the whole stuff around the attack on Dudemont. We switch with that Luskan point of view to the Orkney point of view. And then later on, we switch between, well, at that point, we have the Wolfgar and Morik having adventures in the great outdoors, well, the spine of the world, obviously, and Orkney, and then it's just Orkney, and then we end with, well, Wolfgar apologizing. It's a straightforward book in that regard. The structure makes sense, it works fairly well. I would have cut the first person narration stuff by Drizzt because it's unnecessary. He's not even in the book. He doesn't know what's going on, but he still has to give his 2 cents of don't drink, okay? Which, yeah, I get it. But maybe also think about the fact that your best buddy has a foaming tankard of ale as the coat of arm. Can we just for a moment, I mean, I try not to talk constantly about how bad R.A. Salvatore is with words and stuff. For some reason, he does not say coat of arms. Maybe no one ever told him the term coat of arms, um, or escutcheon, or any of these other ones, because for whatever reason, it's the standard of um, of a foaming mug on Bruner's shield. And I'm like, a standard is something similar, but it feels off to me. But then again, we're talking about a man who calls eyes almond-shaped orbs, and I'm not sure if that's, you know, official in geometry. I thought orbs had to be round and not almond-shaped. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. That's basically the structure. I think it works mostly, apart from these unnecessary first-person narrations. The rest, pacing-wise, is well done. This is, in fact, probably the best written in that regard, best structured, best paced of the novels, really. Um, or at least in a long time. So let's look at the D&D stuff, and then let's look at all the other stuff. All right. So, it doesn't add that much more to, as a Dungeons and Dragons story. It kind of shows that you can tell different stories in the Forgotten Realms. It doesn't always have to be just going searching for treasure and stuff. And it provides, of course, the kingdom, realm, whatever you want to call it, of Orkney, which is a very, very specifically Western medieval realm in that regard, with, a lord and peasants. It feels a bit Highlandy, sort of, although they're also digging for peat. And I'm not a geographer nor a geologist. but I'm not sure if you can dig for peat in, on a mountain pass. I always thought that you needed like a moor or something, which, yeah, I guess can be highlands, but it feels a bit off. My point is, you get that kingdom, which consists of a castle and a bunch of villages. So you get a new setting, sort of. Beyond that, you don't get much more interesting new Dungeons and Dragons things. Technically, you get a lot of detail about the city of Luskan in case you want to play in the city of Luskan, including the whole prison system. If you want to make it darker and grittier and pretty grimdark, I mean, this is a city in which a Sandan Glokta could totally be the nice guy torturer. Let's just say it that way. At least if you think that 14-year-olds come up with better or worse tortures than Joe Abercrombie. That's all of that. We get the mention of a half Cullen. I have no idea what Cullens are. They're apparently another Forgotten Realms race that I have not, in fact, heard about before. They're all wild and they do blow, gun, dart, poison stuff. So I assume a lot of exoticism here. But then again, this is the Forgotten Realms in the year 2000, so we're still not over the hump here. Um, Beyond that, as I said, there's very little that makes it particularly Forgotten Realmsy or particularly Dungeons and Dragonsy, except of course, being gnomes and dwarves and shit. Um, that's not much. So let's talk about all the other stuff because I think this is all about the other stuff. And let's start with a light one before we move into the really bad stuff. See, this is definitely a more adult novel, as the themes of, addiction and sexual assault and even classism in a lot of ways. Feudalism is not exactly made to look good in this book, kind of imply. But I want to start with something that I found interesting. We've often talked about influences in these books, and I've mentioned before that Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, the Lankhmar or Nebon stories, whatever you want to call them, have been a huge impact or influence on Dungeons and Dragons in general. Now, with Morik the Rogue and Wulfgar the Barbarian going on adventures together and being drunk all the time, that influence suddenly comes back to the front, right? Because Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser famously are rogues that do a lot of highwaymanning and stealing. They're thieves, they're rogues, they're doing a lot of unsavory things compared to being heroes. And they're not averse to having a drink here and there or there. In fact, one of the best, or at least most interesting and well known Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories is Ilmet in Lankhmar, which famously is about the two heroes getting incredibly hammered. Only to suffer the terrible consequences of, invading the Thieves Guild while being absolutely smashed. I don't want to say too much here. I think you'd best go and read Ilmet in Lankhmar. It is a classic of fantasy, and you can see all the influences it had on later stuff. Suffice it to say that you can see Fafhrd and the Mouser in Morik as a Mouser like rogue character and Wulfgar as Fafhrd. The problem is, and I think it's just interesting to show this here, is that Fafhrd and the Mouser, while being sort of the good guys, are never, morally good. And it kind of shows where the problems of these Forgotten Realms stories, especially the Salvatore ones, and of course the alignment system kind of comes in. See, Fafhrd and the Mouser are thieves. They do all kinds of illegal stuff, to put it mildly. They're sort of, I guess, the good guys because they fight monsters from time to time. But that's that. So there's a lot of ambivalence here. Morally gray is, I guess, the term that the kids today use. But you know what I mean? There's a lot of ambivalence here. This is not the case with these characters. Wulfgar is a good guy, and we have to understand that he's actually a good guy for his sort of descent into the depths of addiction and crime and whatnot to make sense, to feel like a tragedy, right? Fafhrd can get hammered and do dumb shit and become a more or less luckless highwayman, and it's just another Fafhrd thing. On the other hand, for Wulfgar, it's a tragedy. And that takes a lot of, spirit out of these stories because it feels weird and wrong when Wulfgar decides to become a highwayman, but he has to be unsuccessful because, of course, he's Wulfgar. And the almost comedic element that we find with Fafford and the Mouser with Liber gets lost in Salvatore just not being good at this. So we have the two characters being attacked by a bunch of other highwaymen, and Mori completely taking over the highway band afterwards, and Wolfgar coming back from unconsciousness, regaining consciousness, and getting incredibly upset about it. And we have that whole dynamic that between friends or sort of yeah almost the friends and the buddy cop or at least buddy comedy aspect that makes the Fafford and Mouser story so powerful. We don't get that here because Wolfgar is, I guess, too straight a straight man for Morik to build that kind of rapport. Um, and that's just something I found interesting to see how the strict categorizations that we find in Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms when it comes to morals between the good guys and the bad guys, at least on paper. Obviously, a lot of gaming groups have played incredibly murderous wanderers that are basically just grave robbers that kill everyone. I guess we've all heard these horror stories or been part of them. On paper, this is not something that happens in the Forgotten Realms. They're too morally clear cut. And with Wolfgar and Morik's adventures here, we can see that they're supposed to be the good guys, sort of, but also at the same time they're doing wrong things, and they have to learn that they're doing wrong things. While a Fafford, a Grey Mouser, a Conan, or all the characters, a Kugel the Clever in the Jack Vance Dying Earth stories, those guys are criminals, and that's fine. They're still interesting characters because of that. So that constant, oh, but right now he's in his bad guy phase, so we need to wait for him to realize that he's actually evil. Well, not evil, but bad. It kind of takes away from the story, is my point. And this may be an indication that the format of a Forgotten Realms novel of this character is not necessarily suited for certain mature topics that go beyond the strict characterization or categorization of the alignment cross between good and evil and lawful and chaotic. Just doesn't necessarily work that way. All right, that out of the way, let's talk about the potential, and then let's talk about where it all goes. See, on paper, this book does a lot of very interesting things. Most of these interesting things it does in the Kingdom of Orkney, and the whole Orkney plotline feels like Salvatore trying to write a maybe slightly gothic novel, maybe writing a 19th century novel. I don't want to call it fantasy of manners or whatever, but there's a good story in here somewhere. There's a story about evil overlords and the feudal system crushing the peasants. That there's a story about classism and people not being able to rise above their station because that kind of society is incredibly stratified and in a rigid sort of way, with both sides, with peasants or at least the lower classes holding each other down and keeping each other from rising, while the nobility gets really upset if someone starts to rise. There's a good story in here. And we get glimpses of that. We have that when Lord Ferringale sees Meralda and goes like, "Wow, I want to marry her," and he falls in love with her immediately. It's a device, a plot device. Don't worry. But we have his sister go like, "You can't do that," and we'll talk about his sister later again. What's his name? What's her name? Priscilla. And on the other hand, when the villagers find out about, people are like, "Well, that's above their station, right?" The her love interest, Jacka, his parents go like, "Well, we're peasants. We'll always be peasants, and no one should rise above their station." So it shows the idea that these kind of systems are deeply ingrained, but it doesn't do anything with it. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just like window dressing because these topics, the level of stratified society, the more realistic approach is not something that is usually in Dungeons and Dragons or in the Forgotten Realms and hasn't been mentioned before. This is the first time we see peasants having peasant problems beyond Drizzt and Wolfgar running into Coneyberry in at the beginning of the Halfling's Gem. Ever since we were like, where does all the food come from? I guess there's farmers somewhere that we can steal horses from in the Streams of Silver or ask the way off, but that's it. For the largest part, of these Forgotten Realms stories, peasants have basically been gas stations where people can get, ask for the way and get their horses refueled or get horses, and that's that. Now we suddenly have the idea that yes, there is an entire society built about, agriculture and stuff like that. So it it almost feels like Salvatore doesn't know what to do with it. He gets the right ideas here and there with this stratification and the the willingness or unwillingness of both sides to overlook differences there. The problem is, as I said, that it doesn't go anywhere. It's just window dressing, unfortunately. But I wanted to mention it that there could have been something good in here. Then there is, of course, the idea of true love versus duty, and that's kind of the problem, right? Miralda is in love with Jack, and for now we'll just assume that it's true love and whatnot. But she has to actually marry the Lord because the Lord can just like make her because he's the boss. On the other hand, there's economic issues, right? Her mother is incredibly sick, and they can't afford a cleric to heal her, or in this, or what you might call a doctor. But if she marries the Lord can totally do that, and he does. But so there are economic pressures and the duties that she may or may not have to her family. All of these things could make for a very interesting, nuanced discussion of economic pressures, familial pressures, and so forth. In when it comes to women in this case, but in general, humanity. You could do all of that. Unfortunately, this is once again a story that has to be over in like 400 pages, and we also have to do the Wolfgar stuff on the side, and have to have a number of just unnecessary combat with giants and orcs and whatnot. So there's not that much time to explore any of that, but it's all in here. The basics are in here. The same from the other side, the idea that there is this like sort of nobility at the arse end of nowhere that have like no power whatsoever, and they're poor and whatnot. But the older sister Priscilla is very much focused on keeping her station and keeping the whole thing clear. These are stereotypes and these are cliches, of course. If you've ever read like any 19th century novel or any 18th century novel, you've met these characters, just written much, much better because people took their time to explore the background, to explore the, surrounding morality and so forth. We don't get that here. We once again get just basically one trick pony characters, like people that have one nuance. We have the elderly servant, steward, whatever you want to call him, who kind of is understanding and steers everything. We have the bitter old older sister, which I guess made R.A. Salvatore open a dictionary and look up the word shrewish. So I guess thanks, he learned a word. I'm proud of him. But it's an incredibly poor portrait, right? We don't even know why she is this way. It's like, yeah, is she this way because she's ugly? And she was described as ugly. Let's just not forget that, because Salvatore does keep to the good-looking good people, bad-looking bad people distinction in these books. There's a lot of casual misogyny in the way she's described versus how Meralda is described, for no reason that gets never explored. Is there something she really wants to do? Is there some hopes that were lost, dashed, dreams that were crushed, all of that stuff? No, she's just evil and angry and wants to kill the baby. You see, I'm almost losing track here because it's once again there's a lot of potential in these stories, and it just does not get explored because Dungeons and Dragons does not necessarily provide the framework to tell this kind of story. And possibly Salvatore, while having maybe read one Jane Austen novel in his life, can't take that away from him, has probably not looked into what makes these stories tick, what makes these stories work versus what doesn't. So he just takes the surface ideas of the noble lord who's not actually that noble, and he has true love there, and his sister is against it because of course someone has to be against it, and it just goes nowhere but negative stereotypes. Because there's this thing that while we have positive stereotypes and they're problematic, don't get me wrong, most of our stereotypes are kind of callous and cruel, casually cruel, and that casual cruelty comes through again. So now, Let's look at the main problems with this novel, which is once again Wolfgar's alcoholism, and of course, on the other hand, the pregnancy story. Because, as I said, there could have been a good story in here. But what we get instead is something I hinted at yesterday, which is that in these cases where things get muddled and morally complex, Salvatore falls back to a very specific, basic morality and narrative. It's a very conservative one. See, so when she decides to marry the Lord, Miralda selfishly decides to have one night with the guy she really truly loves, Jacka. And they have that, and she gets pregnant, which kicks off that whole story about the false rape allegations and so forth, right? It does that. Now, here's the problem. From that point onwards and around that, it's made very clear that that was a selfish and wrong decision. She should have waited and had, had her first time with Lord Ferringale, because Jacka is not worth it. Jacka just wants to get her in. He's clearly marked as a childish character. Don't get me wrong. There's certainly something realistic in that, and that he just wants to, well, have sex with her to prove something. And we've seen these characters. He's not necessarily the wrong character, but the story is very much that she falls for it because she lacks moral backbone to understand and see through the fact that all men just want her virginity. There's a level of purity culture, and I'm obviously grew up in a fairly liberal society, so I'm not touched by this, but it feels very much like the entire time the book is, after all, blaming Miralda for giving in. The idea that it could have been like a story about her emancipating herself and taking that one thing for herself, but instead she does that, and it's portrayed as selfishness or immoral, and then all the tragedy kind of comes from that, because she did that one mistake. And that's a narrative you've heard before. It's a narrative that usually only girls get told. Like in this book, I mean, it's almost progressive that we also learn that the guy Jacka is a bit of a dickhead, but usually the story is girls fall for boys, and we need to protect girls. The story of having to protect your purity, your innocence, your virginity, that's something that is usually just told to women. And the fact that it focuses once again on her in that regard, in low-key blames her for the whole thing, it's pretty fucking toxic, isn't it? And I think that's one part that I really, really, really hated. The next part is, of course, the idea that lapse of moral character, that losing of innocence because of her selfishness, leads her to do the thing, which is a false rape allegation. And we've had these before, haven't we? And it's once again a very welcome narrative. That welcome narrative being, of course, women lie. Which, let's be very, very clear here, has maybe happened once or twice, but for the overwhelming part, rape allegations are, or allegations of sexual assault are true, and you should believe all victims, always. Period. It's just there. So having a story, and this is once again, this is a book targeted at mostly young boys, and having a story where a woman falsely accuses the hero of having assaulted her for her own selfish gains. Yeah, I don't know. I think it might be slightly harmful. just just a smidgen. It's it's it really. I mean, we're reaching the end of the books I read as a kid, and it really fucked me up back then, and it still fucks me up right now. This is the book I was dreading to come to, because I knew this would happen. The Wolfgar's alcoholism or false rape allegation plot line. So we get that, and then after all, right, she figures out she's pregnant. And this is a world full of magic. She could just get an abortion, but she can't, because getting an abortion is not in something, not something that TSR, and this was still published by TSR, could have in their books. Because this is still conservative rural America, or the audience is still very much white middle class America. So she can't do that. So we have to find a way to threaten the child, and then Wolfgar takes over the child and becomes the hero at the end. That story is, there, as I said, like there's so much wrong with it. It's like she falls for the guy because obviously it's her fault, not his fault. Then She makes up a false sexual assault allegation. And then she can't abort the child, so uh, because life, eh, all of this is so messed up because someone somewhere, and I'm not sure who to blame here. It could be Salvatore, it could be the editing department at TSR that you don't want to have that kind of story tied to what is ostensibly a game still at the time marketed to children. But it's the worst kind of sex ed that you can imagine, with the worst kind of narratives about women that young men get fed still to this day, all tied into this one messed up story, which is such a, such disappointment because it could have been a serious good story if it would, Salvatore had allowed himself to write a story for adult people, for human beings with a bit of life experience, for grown-up people. But he's not allowed to, or he doesn't allow himself. I don't know. So I'm going to be vague with, calling anyone specifically out here, because it could have been either. But it certainly leads, that framework, I think, prevents the book from actually being about the topics that it should be about. So suddenly all of this stuff becomes, once again, tools to bring our main character, this being Wolfgar, into situations where he can be Wolfgar and be a hero. So it kind of uses these things, including the false rape allegations, as a tool to give him a prison break, and let him then heroically find himself, find responsibility, and become a good guy again. And that's pretty fucked up. So let's talk about the alcoholism quick, and then hopefully end this, because we need to. As I said in the conversation on the Silent Blade, having Wolfgar, after 6 years of torture, suffer from PTSD and even become an alcoholic, become addicted to whatever substance to dull the pain and so forth, is a good idea. Like, fantasy can do these kind of things. Fantasy can deal with trauma from war and all kinds of other stuff. It's done so ever since Tolkien started writing Lord of the Rings, really. So there's nothing new there. And you can do that in a lot of interesting ways. Salvatore does not do that, however. Instead, alcoholism becomes evil alcoholism versus, the good beer drinking of the dwarfs, which, is a thing. And as someone born in Germany, where the legal drinking age for beer is 16 and for everything else is 18, I'm in a culture where casual drinking is very much part of society, whereas being, a heavy drinker is obviously still frowned upon. And there is something to be said about the hypocrisy between casual drinking and alcoholism and how we talk about them in society. This book doesn't do that. We, on the one hand, have the dwarves and we make fun of them drinking their holy water and having hangovers, and doing dumb shit when they're drunk. And then we have Wolfgar, who becomes a raging monster whenever he's drunk and destroys all society around him, all his connections, his relationships, and so forth. But it doesn't get explored. It's just like, well, he's got trauma, so he's doing trauma drinking, so actually that's bad. And yeah, self medication is probably not the best way to do these things. And maybe the Forgotten Realms are not necessarily the place to discuss the reasons why people self medicate, because they maybe don't provide the correct framework here. I get that. The story that he then, has to go down to the lowest. He gets falsely accused. It would have been something else if he actually does any of the things that, or something really terrible, murder someone in rage or whatever. But the murder attempt and all of the things that get him out there are because he gets innocently or wrongly accused. And then he becomes a highwayman, sort of, but also Salvatore makes sure that Wolfgar doesn't actually do anything really horrendous, because he's still the good guy, right? He can't be put through the ringer. He gets put through like a pretend ringer in a lot of ways. All we get is a lurid description of torture at the carnival, the pirate carnival, whatever it's called, the the torture, the public torture and execution place, in Luskan. He gets put through that so we can talk about, the rat cage, and we can talk about the quartering, drawn and quartering. Apparently, Salvatore got really fascinated by torture methods because we get that in lurid detail. But he's still the innocent guy, right? He's still innocent. And then at some point, he just stays sober and does good, positive, hard work for a while, and then decides to save the child, and that gives him meaning and responsibility. And here's the thing: yes, finding meaning and finding place of responsibility and so forth is one way of overcoming trauma, certainly in the right framework with therapy and all of the other care that you need for that. To build the story of guy just finds responsibility, stops drinking, becomes a good guy again, to tell that kind of story to people who are still developing when they're reading these books, because once again, these are YA novels, who hope either are either going to come very close to becoming addicts themselves, or have people with any form of addiction in their family to tell them that very specific narrative, that it's the individual who does that, and it's Wolfgar who does that to himself, right? Including the healing. It's a question of willpower. And the narrative that overcoming addiction, that overcoming trauma, is a question of willpower, is an incredibly toxic one, because it makes everyone who's struggling with addiction and is not getting out of it feel like they're a failure, a moral failure, and they have, a failure of will, and that leads to even more, self implications, and even more self punishing. It's an incredibly toxic narrative. Most of us can't get out of trauma, can't get out of addiction without serious external help, which Wolfgang doesn't have, because obviously the Forgotten Realms don't have healthcare or mental health professionals. He just has to do all of it by himself, pull himself up by the bootstraps, and overcome even the false rape allegations. All of this together is just such a terrible mess, because while we have a lot of realistic problems, the solution at the end of the day is a solution that has to be done by rolling a bunch of dice and by applying very specific 1950s high school morals, where even looking at boys before you get married is going to cause you all kinds of problems and turn you into a terrible person. And the only way out of that will be further crimes like lying and being bad, and it has to be the man who will save her. And this I think is, at the end of the day, is the most toxic part of it. Like, Wolfgang gets wrongly accused and he still saves the girl and the woman and everyone. Is like, you've turned something that could have been about a woman trying to survive in a toxically masculine patriarchal society with incredibly weird misogynist norms around sexuality. But it's not that story. What it is a story about a man making it, giving his forgiveness, and out of the goodness of his heart, allowing one woman to get away with the silly mistake of wanting to fuck. And that's bad. That's really, really bad. And it makes me really, really angry. And I'm so happy that we're nearing the absolute end of these fucking stories, because I'm so done with their minimal, well, not minimal, like non-existent morality. They're non-existent characters. They're a series of terrible fights just to, showcase other monsters, spells, and whatnot. The whole mess. And whenever they try to do something else, they fail so consistently, because the underlying moral framework is still incredibly conservative. It is structurally misogynist. It is structurally racist. We haven't even talked about the fact that, the one guy getting accused of rape is, of course, the one who is, in this case, native coded, the one who is, the outsider. Look, these books can't be saved, because the fundamental structure, the world they're built upon, has been warped by so many toxic ideas, so many toxic ideologies, from uptight evangelical Christian sexual morality to the structural misogyny built into it, the structural racism built into them. It's a mess. You can't save it. It's fucked. And people still go and read these books, and I don't know, it makes me cry and makes me weep and makes me yell. And I guess it's entertaining, but maybe we should actually go and read good books. or tell good stories, because it's possible to tell good stories at gaming tables. But these ain't it. These ain't fucking it. And with these words, I'll leave you to it and go and meet with friends to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I'll try my best not to fall into any of these stereotypes that I've been banging on about for the last 12 books. And we'll have one more, which will be Sea of Swords. I know there's a bit of a problem that sometimes Servant to the Shard is actually considered the follow up. We'll go with Sea of Swords because that's the one I own. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Until then, happy Epiphany. Cheers.